Hello everyone and welcome to Heart Machine's Hyper Light Drifter, a 2D action role-playing game. Set in a futuristic, broken land, the player takes the role of the Drifter, a character that has access to technology long since forgotten by the inhabitants of the world, but is suffering from a terrible illness. Hyper Light Drifter pays homage to 8-bit and 16-bit games, and draws heavy inspiration from classic Legend of Zelda and Diablo even. Throughout the game, the player explores 4 regions, each with NPCs that describe the land's history through colorful storyboards and various enemies eager to cut you down without mercy. Jumping straight into it, I'd like to discuss just some of the user experience design features that Heart Machine got right, and they got a lot right. I'll only mention a few though. First off, the visual effects, art, and animation. Ruling out the subjectivity of whether or not players even like this art style, it is arguably very well done in terms of environment and sprite animations. There are many nuanced lighting and animation aspects with the sprites that offer descriptive and clear distinctions. Sword swings, dashes, weapon effects, even body language is conveyed to the player. And not just by the Drifter, but NPCs and enemies as well. Their movements, attacks, idle animations, and other effects all look fleshed out and very detailed. Foliage swaying in the wind, water effects, falling leaves. The detail is there, as it should be, being a pixel art game in modern times. In terms of UX purposes, what this accomplishes is a reduction of player confusion. In other words, there's more clarity for the player to discern what's tangible versus intangible, what's breakable versus unbreakable, what's an environment piece versus an enemy. Moving right along, second is Hyper Light Drifter's game-to-player feedback. In short, it's responsive, impactful, and meaningful. And let me go into more detail about those. The feedback is responsive in that the controls and inputs are quick and occur without lag. If it ever feels unresponsive, that's purposeful through the animation time, such as healing or some attacks, like swinging your sword. Because of the animation times, players will do well to avoid button mashing, instead to respond when needed, like counting your sword swings, dashing after shooting, etc. This type of design creates a smooth and refined game feel for those who work with it in practice. The feedback is impactful in that any action that occurs with the Drifter can be felt, for lack of a better word. Again, through animation, but also through screen shake effects and flashy visuals, the player is given clear feedback of whether or not an attack connected. And this works the other way around as well, on a deeper level than just losing health points. Getting hit gives the player heavy visual and auditory feedback that tells them that they definitely do not want that to happen again. It shows a fantastic understanding of how visual effects and sound effects relate and combine to create impactful play. Even with all of these feedback methods congealing into different stimuli, they're given to the player in an unobtrusive and diegetic way. They fit within the context of play and keep from hindering the player. And finally, the feedback is meaningful in that it aims to teach the player without telling them outright. No hints, no combat tips, no short guides. Everything is to be learned through meaningful feedback. For example, like I already mentioned, taking hits from enemies is jarring. Connecting attacks is satisfying. Working out the Drifter's animation frames is rewarding. The third and final pro I want to mention is the dynamic, personalized play experiences offered for the user. Hyper Light Drifter doesn't have any specified leveling system or progression. Instead, it just offers freedom of choice and exploration through an accessible map and purchasable upgrades. From the get-go, the player is allowed to go to any of the regions as they please, with exception of the south, which is blocked off. Plus, each region, including the hub city, has a fast travel plate. This way, players are able to break from a difficult region, upgrade their gear, or simply head somewhere else. Upgrade bits, or the currency, are found in each of the regions, and collecting enough means putting those points into whatever the player prefers back at the hub city in the appropriate stores. What this does is it changes existing mechanics in interesting ways, rather than just simply adding new ones. Be it survivability and health, sword tricks and melee enhancements, ranged weapon improvements, or modifications to the dash. This keeps the cognitive load low on the user, but stretches them that much more to implement their new abilities and improve their performance. This advocates for personalized playstyles, resulting in completely different play experiences between users. One user may focus on upgrading guns and exploring the northern area first, while another may prioritize survivability and upgrading health when heading west. Now, on to the cons list. Honestly, the following list was pretty difficult to compile. I had to get hypercritical and really look into the details that could be improved, and ended up getting pretty dang nitpicky near the end. That's a good indicator of Heart Machine's ability to design positive user experiences, at least. However, as with most things, it's always possible to find room for improvement. Actively looking for and identifying even the smallest issues with our creations help us improve, and that's what we're here to do. So, first things first. The feature that's actually a pretty jarring con is aspects of the game's isometric perspective. The game is beautiful and all, but sometimes the top-down viewpoint can actually hinder the player's ability to discern the game environment. Tree canopies are the worst offender of this, as there's no indication as to where objects are underneath them, as well as other instances like discerning whether an object has collision or not, or even determining what's part of the map and what's a ledge you can fall off of. This can make exploration, which is a big part of the game, pretty frustrating, alongside giving rise to issues. While the isometric perspective is a classic and follows their homage to old style of games, it still needs to be clear and consistent in order to work. Older pixel art games like Legend of Zelda and Pokemon that use this perspective had static, consistent, impassable objects that would often take up an entire space. A path and direction was always clear because objects held one dimension, tangible or not. However, even then, there's a reason those games were made that way, and that's their age. Game design wasn't at the level it is now, and there were more restrictions and simpler design goals in place. If developers wish to make more games with this perspective, communicating map design to their players is essential. A simple fix would be to give any enemy or object underneath these areas the same shaded gray outline the player character gets. That way, the player will clearly see how to navigate, as well as understand what's a tree trunk versus an item versus an enemy. Perhaps even only showing these outlines once the player is within the boundaries of the area. The next con on the list is the in-game map design. In short, the map is horribly difficult to understand and seemingly unnecessarily confusing. Specifically, it's especially difficult to determine what is an accessible area or path from what is simply art and aesthetic. The underground maps are even more complex, and all this coupled with the fact that there's no legend or indicator as to what's what. It does a great job of communicating the general world layout and area overviews. Whether this was the main intention or not, it was done well in this regard. In this case, the map is best used for generalities, for deciding, okay, so my next objective is somewhere to my west, then figuring out how to get there through exploration and best guesses. This is fine and all, but it should be more obvious as to which type of map it's aiming to be. It's misleading when the map actually depicts pathways and tunnels, but doesn't tell you whether or not they're even accessible. Some fixes to this could be, say, highlighting walkable areas of the map. This would clearly communicate to the player what is aesthetic versus what is traversable. Another fix could be being able to zoom into the area the player is in. Instead of a constant general world overview that indicates what area the player is in, it could be a more specific, detailed look at one area at a time. This would allow more freedom to the designers in order to specify navigable boundaries. The third con is where it starts to get a little nitpicky, and that's the shallow interactions with NPCs. Aside from the NPCs that communicate through storyboards, I'm talking specifically about the ones in the town, and how they feel as though they're just pixels on the screen. It seems that their only purpose is to make the player feel like an outsider, but that could be done more clearly than simple, uninterpretive noises and avoidance. The character has a box around them that the NPCs actively avoid, and the player can even end up cornering them and bugging them out so they just kind of vibrate in place trying to move. When looking at this from the story's perspective, it becomes a little more understandable. The player is a drifter, after all, a stranger and outsider to the residents. The only other drifter in town was mugged and beaten on arrival, so it's understandable that the character would be avoided. However, it's not completely evident that that's what they're doing, as the only interaction they give comes from a meaningless symbol that appears above their sprite when they make their grunts. Other than the avoidance aspect, it seems like the NPCs can be talked to, but in reality they cannot, and it's a lot of time wasted for the player to try to interact with each town member they see in hopes of something meaningful, something different from the next. In short, their interactions are misleading. There could be a few minor fixes to this that don't compromise the no wordage design goal, but they could still change the clarity for the better. One could be to change the symbol above the sprite to something more universally understood. Instead of a colored square, show a frowny face or an angry face. Even an ellipsis could tell the player that these NPCs don't want to and will not talk back. Another change could be getting rid of any interaction at all. The noises and symbol act like a falsehood that perhaps one of these times an NPC will do something different. By simply making the townspeople only avoid, the player could get a clear message that these townspeople want nothing to do with them. And finally, a small bug that occurs in more areas than one, and that's wall hacking. In some instances, especially during battle arenas, where the player walks into an area and is ambushed, the level design changes. Floors fall to create pathways or death pits, while other sections rise into pillars, creating new walls and obstacles that the player has to work around. In the later case of the two, if the player is on the section of flooring that rises, they will simply just be engulfed by it and find themselves hidden within the obstacle. The character can't do anything from here but move. Swinging the swords results in hitting the wall they're inside of, as well shooting their gun. Luckily, the player doesn't get stuck or anything, they can just walk right out and be fine, but it's still a bug. A small oversight that can be used as an exploit. Assuming this is unintentional by the design team, a bug fix could be implemented to change this. Either have it so the character is pushed out of the way to the nearest open space when the flooring rises, or even have the character rise with it. New map. Overall, Hyper Light Drifter exemplifies many features that create a positive user experience. Heart Machine must have some great minds on the team to create a well-executed, original, and modernized mix of the classic isometric gaming experience. However, as with anything in life, there is always room for improvements, even if they're the finer, less noticeable details. I wanted to focus more on the cons this time around, since I think there's more value in highlighting what's wrong than the bits they got right. Let me know if you found any other things to pick at with Hyper Light Drifter in the comments, or if you just want to gush about Hyper Light Drifter as I want to. In any case, that's all I had to offer for now, so I'll be turning in for the day. This has been Adam Cockman.